I'm going to begin by kind of running through a brief history of vaccination in its policy context and approaches that have been taken. And then the second half really looks at vaccination uptake and questions about demand and when demand happens and when people refuse vaccinations and why they do. And I'll set out some possible frameworks. Today we're thinking about vaccines, and I wanted just to start by saying why this topic. Why might vaccination be an interesting lens to look through if we want to think about health and development more broadly? We're talking here about a big key global health issue. Vaccination is a big policy priority in many countries and globally. It's the source of a great deal of investment by private sector companies. It's the source of a lot of scientific research. But it also, I think, is quite good to think with. And certainly in the work I did around vaccination a few years ago, subsequently, I've gone on finding it a very powerful window to think about some broader themes that are critically important in health and public health, and actually in development generally. One is to think about public health and what public health policy is about, and about the relationship between the health of individuals and bodies and that more public sense of protecting populations and communities. It's also a useful lens for thinking about technologies in health, about new technologies, old technologies, and about some of the challenges and issues that arise in delivering those technologies, not just from a technical standpoint or not just from a supply standpoint, but also about the social context and particularly the political dimensions which often surround people's understandings of and willingness to engage with and accept or perhaps feel worried about technologies of different kinds. And so thirdly, vaccination has been the subject of quite a lot of controversies over recent years, but actually controversies around vaccination have haunted vaccination since the very, very beginning. So it's quite a useful lens to think about controversies in health and actually controversies in science and policy more generally. Why is vaccination interesting? What are some of the big claims and characteristics that surround this? Well, first of all, it's claimed to be one of the two most effective public health interventions that there have ever been, okay, and the other being clean water. It's also claimed to be the most cost-effective public health intervention in terms of straight cost-benefit, in terms of mortality and morbidity reductions ever. It's also, I think, interesting because it's so incredibly universal. If you think about it, we were all probably as babies vaccinated, or if we weren't, it was expected that we would be. And there are probably some quite interesting reasons why we weren't, which we could explore. But there's an expectation that vaccination is something that is done to every baby, every child, everywhere. And then, of course, there are other vaccinations that are available to people later in life. And I think this kind of universalism, and indeed the sort of universalism in the expectations of the technology and how it's rolled out, is actually quite rare and quite unique. There are very few other technologies which have that quality of being expected to be so universal. Of course, despite that universalism, there are quite a lot of variations too. There are different vaccinations for different diseases, which work in slightly different ways. There are variants in the basic ways that vaccines work. Some of the essential differences that you've got kind of live vaccines where it's actually almost a small part of the disease, an antigen from the disease which induces an immune response in the body. You've also got what are sometimes called dead vaccines, where the vaccination involves an introduction of the antibodies directly. And then there are new generations of vaccines which work through DNA in various ways. There are also some different forms of delivery. There are vaccines that are injected, there are others that are oral, like the polio vaccine. There are others, quite interesting generation of vaccines that almost overlap with foods and plant-based vaccines, and interesting, quite cutting-edge research around genetically modifying plants to include vaccines within them. But those, as it were, variants on the technology side. I think what's also critical is that these technologies come to mean very different things as they are applied and delivered in different worlds and locations and places and societies and communities and cultural settings that are extremely different. Let's take a very brief run through a history of vaccination. Now, this is only one history. There are many histories one could tell. And this is a particular one that I think comes across quite nicely through a look at some of the campaigns that have emerged around vaccination from some of its earliest days. And a few years ago, the World Health Organization published a lovely big glossy coffee table book around the history of public health campaigns. It was part of their 50th anniversary, and they took up a number of different topics. HIV was one, sexual health was another, and vaccination was one of them. And the posters are very telling about these different eras on what was expected of vaccination at different points. But the origins precede the posters, and for many, those origins are traced to the UK and to a country doctor called Edward Jenner in 1796. And this is a kind of heroism story. What Jenner did at a time when smallpox was a rife disease that was killing people in the UK and around the world in a big way was discover through sort of experimentation in his own GP surgery that cowpox, which was a sort of milder disease that afflicted dairymaids often because it was linked with cattle, and had some similar qualities to smallpox. And by variolating, introducing a tiny little bit of the cowpox antigen into the arms and the bodies of some of these people who were in contact with smallpox, immunity against smallpox was created. So these experiments on the quiet in the dairy farms of rural England actually became then the basis of developing a smallpox vaccine in a sort of story of heroism. But what's quite interesting is that actually there's further medical history work which shows that this actually wasn't where the vaccination story all began, and that there were already indigenous techniques in various parts of the world, in particular in parts of Asia, with this idea of variolation, which is the introduction of a small bit of the disease into a body to induce immunity into the future. And that actually a different story about technology diffusion would see that vaccination was introduced into Europe from Asia via the Middle East much earlier in the 1700s, so before this kind of discovery by a UK doctor. And there's medical history work from parts of Africa as well, which shows that variolation was an established indigenous practice. But smallpox was certainly the beginning of the vaccination heroic story in Europe, and by the early 19th century, this vaccine had been produced, and there began to be campaigns to roll it out in European settings in a context where smallpox really was a very nasty and very bad disease. So all kinds of anxieties and rumours flew, and some of the writings about those early 19th century periods talk about how the poor of Victorian London, who were expected to be vaccinated against smallpox, saw this as a way of kind of repressing them and trying to keep them quiet and passive. What were vaccines really doing? Were they a way of kind of repressing the working classes? And people also had all kinds of worries about the link with cowpox, and actually would these vaccines turn them into sort of cow-like beings? It was about the idea of introducing something that was seen to have an animal origin into human bodies. But it still was rolled out, and smallpox began to decline over quite a long period. The next kind of heroism story really was the 1940s and 50s, at a time when polio, in a sort of endemic form, but also in epidemics, caused enormous worry and enormous maiming and disability. And it was the invention and then the rolling out of a polio vaccine in the 1950s, from 1955, that really began to be very successful and to reduce cases quite dramatically. So this is a poster from that period, which is actually encouraging people really for the first time to come forward. And this is an interesting poster because it plays on fear, and it plays on the idea of kind of doing things in time. And this is a family who hadn't been in time, as it were. And I think the implication is that this child has polio. But these were not only disease issues in the global north, and rather later in the day, the attack on smallpox and also on measles, which was a very serious infant killer in other parts of the world, and particularly in Africa. In the 1960s and 70s, just post-colonially, was the era when we saw the World Health Organization and particularly the American Centers for Disease Control launching a big internationally focused campaign to attack smallpox and measles and its huge effects, particularly on child health as well as adult health. And what's interesting is that this, unlike that kind of misery poster of the previous era, what we're seeing now is a fight. This use of kind of military metaphors, that here is a disease and immunisation, vaccination is part of almost the kind of weaponry, the armoury that the world now has against a disease. And these sort of military metaphors have continued in some areas of vaccination policy. And they became quite literal at this time, because in the late colonial period, much public health work in African contexts was very closely linked with often quite coercive military campaigns, which were about both using armies and organised military forces to deliver public health interventions, because they were organised and they were a force which one could kind of send out to sort of do things in rural areas. But there were also other kinds of links, even at this time, between public health and the control of population in other ways. And one only has to read some of the sort of histories of colonial medicine, and this was a kind of just post-colonial medicine, to understand the relationships between coercive public health and militarism even at that time. And, for instance, fears of disease were often used as pretext for moving populations out of areas where they weren't very convenient. Settlers in East Africa or the creation of national parks often required the movement of people who were inconveniently settled there. And often fears of disease and military campaigns to relocate people were part and parcel of those approaches. People like Megan Vaughan and Susan White have written very evocatively of these periods. And I think it's ironic that actually an attempt to deal with disease is also drawing both metaphorically and realistically on the use of often military coercion.